Hello, patrons. Mr. Gage here from the East Cleveland Public Library with a Google Earth tour of the book Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule by Jennifer Schiavarini. Special howdy and welcome to my book group friends at the McGregor Retirement Center who voted on this book. Because of his historical importance to the country and the world, the landscape of Jule, Gabriel, Julia Dent Grant, and Ulysses S. Grant still exists, and exploring it virtually will hopefully provide us a little insight into the world of this novel. So come explore with us. A quick timeline of Ulysses S. Grant's life. In April 27th, 1822, Ulysses S. Grant was born Hiram Ulysses Grant in Point Pleasant, Ohio. In 1823, the family moves to Georgetown. In 1839, Grant is accepted to West Point. In 1843, he graduates from West Point. In 1844, Grant visits the home of college friend Frederick Dent. This is his first visit to Whitehaven, where he meets his future wife, Julia. So, the first stop on our tour is Ulysses S. Grant's birthplace in Point Pleasant, Ohio. Ulysses S. Grant was born here in 1822. The home was built in 1817, and in 1821, Jesse Root Grant wed Hannah Simpson Grant. These are Ulysses' parents, and they move into the home where they pay $2 a month in rent. The future president only lived in Point Pleasant for less than a month, or less than a year, as his family moved to Georgetown 1 month before his first birthday. This is the location of Ulysses S. Grant's boyhood home. Unfortunately, the street view isn't so great, so we can't get a close-up. However, when Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule mentions Grant visiting his family in Ohio, this is the house, and then of course the schoolhouse where he is visiting. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point, which is where Ulysses S. Grant meets Julia's brother Frederick, is the oldest continually operating Army post in the United States. Upon graduation in 1843, Ulysses S. Grant stood out 21st in a class of 29 who finished the military and academic curriculum of the Academy. This is Grant Hall at West Point. And in the corner, the upper left corner, you can see what is the Lee Hall. So it's kind of interesting that Grant now has an entire hall at West Point named after him. This is Whitehaven. This site, also known as the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, commemorates the life, military career, and presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. 5 historic structures are preserved at the site, including the childhood home of Ulysses' wife, Julia Dent Grant. Whitehaven was an 850-acre plantation worked by enslaved people. Grant supervised their forced labor from 1854 to 1859. Whitehaven is mentioned throughout Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule, and many of the opening chapters occur in this building. So, April 25th, 1846 to February 2nd, 1848, the Mexican-American War occurs. 18 or August 22nd, 1848, Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Dent are married at Whitehaven. In 1848, Grant is sent to Detroit, and his family comes with him. Grant is then assigned to the Madison Barracks for repair work. In 1856, Grant enters life as a civilian and builds the shack Hardscrapple on 80 acres that Julia's father gifts them. The whole family finally moves into this shack in September. In 1857, Julia Dent Grant's mother dies. Grant's family returns to Whitehaven. So this is a view of the Madison Barracks. The Madison Barracks are a military installation established in the 19th century at Sackett's Harbor after the War of 1812. It was named for James Madison, who would complete his presidency in 1817. Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Dent Grant live here after they are married. This is discussed briefly in Chapter 4 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. This is the Grant house that Ulysses S. Grant and his wife Julia Dent Grant lived in April 1849 through May of 1850. This is also part of Chapter 4 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. And this is Hardscrabble. This is the house that Ulysses S. Grant built for his wife, Julia, and their family. This is where they lived from April 1849 through May of 1850, and this is also part of Chapter 4 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. So, April 1860, the Grant family moves to Galena. Ulysses works for his two brothers in the family leather business. In April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on the Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Most historians argue that this is the beginning of the Civil War. In May 10th, 1861, there is the Camp Jackson affair, which is mentioned briefly in Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. In November 7th, 1861, there's the Battle of Belmont. And in February 6th, 1862, the Battle of Fort Henry occurs. In February 11th through February 16th, the Battle of Fort Donelson happens. April 6th and 7th, 1862, Battle of Shiloh, Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. April 29th through May 30th, 1862, is the Siege of Corinth. December 29th, 1862 through January 11th, 1863 is what is known as the Vicksburg Campaign and the Battle of Vicksburg. September 21st through November 25th, 1863 is the Chattanooga Campaign. So all of these battles and campaigns are mentioned throughout Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. These are all the battles and conflicts in which Ulysses S. Grant participated. So this is the Grant home at Galena. So we are jumping ahead to Chapter 6 in Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. The Grant family arrives in Galena in 1860 and rent a small Federal-style brick house. Grant had ended a 15-year military career 6 years earlier, but enjoyed little business success as a civilian. He had hoped to reverse his economic misfortune by moving to northwestern Illinois, where he would work the store owned by his father and managed by his younger brothers, Simpson and Orville. Also, note the statue of Julia Dent Grant featured on the walkway up to the house. So there's the statue of Julia Dent Grant, and of course, in the background is the little brick house. When Jule witnesses the Camp Jackson massacre in Chapter 7 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule, there are mentions of General Lyon. This is the memorial to General Lyon at the old location of the St. Louis Arsenal. And the St. Louis Arsenal itself was moved to the Jefferson Barracks location in 1871. From 1859 to 1873, this is the home of Jesse, Ruth, and Hannah Simpson Grant, parents of General Ulysses S. Grant. Jesse is serving as postmaster of Covington from 1866 to 1872. General Grant's sister Mary lives here with her husband, Reverend Michael Kramer, who serves as the United States Minister to Denmark. President Grant visits this house on several occasions. In January of 1862, This is where he sends his wife and children to live while he is at war. This occurs in chapter 9 of the novel Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. This is also where the Grants learn about Ulysses' successes at the Battle of Fort Donelson. This is the Curley House, um, which is in Corinth, Mississippi. During the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, General Braxton Bragg of the Confederate States Army stayed in this house, as did General Earl Van Dorn. Later, General Henry Halleck of the Union Army stays in this house. And down the street is the house where Grant and Julia Dent Grant live. The photograph of that house is in the lower left-hand corner. The Curley House is the only house left standing from that era, but there are plaques on the Corinth Civil War tour that mention where the various other houses, including the one that Julia, Grant, Ulysses, and their family stayed during the siege of Corinth. All of this again occurs during the chapter 10 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. Also during chapter 10 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule, in November 1862, Holly Springs is invaded and occupied by federal troops led by General Ulysses S. Grant. This building, Airleywood, remained unharmed during Confederate General Earl Van Dorn's famous raid against Holly Springs in 1862. After the raid, General Grant occupies this house, and the Grant family celebrates Christmas here in 1862. They remain here until January of 1863, when they leave for Memphis. This property was donated to Russ College, who still own and maintain it. So that is what it looks like currently on the left. And on the right, you can see a picture of Grant on his horse in front of the building. This is the Gayozo Hotel, where Ulysses S. Grant and later his family stay to prepare for the siege of Vicksburg. Much of Chapter 11 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule occurs in this hotel. This is the site of the Vicksburg campaign and the siege of Vicksburg, which is one of the major battles that changed the tide of the Civil War. The campaign and siege are seen through the eyes of Julia Grant and Jule in chapter 12 of the novel Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. I wanted to just show you how big the Vicksburg campaign was and kind of what a wide-ranging area the visitor center and the military park take. This is the visitor center at Vicksburg National Military Park. And this is the statue of Ulysses S. Grant at Vicksburg National Military Park. Little more history. March 2nd, 1864, Grant is promoted to General-in-Chief. April 12th, 1864, the Fort Pillow Massacre decision occurs. May 4th through June 24th, 1864, is Grant's overland campaign against Robert E. Lee. This culminates in the Siege of Petersburg in June of 1864, and then in April 9th of 1865 is Lee's surrender at Appomattox. So I wanted to show a photo of downtown Washington, D.C. as it currently stands, just to show you how very close the Willard Hotel is to the White House. If you see the Willard Hotel is here and the White House is over here, it really is a couple blocks that Madame Jule and Mrs. Grant would have had to walk to get to the White House. So this is the Willard Hotel as it stands now. This is where Ulysses S. Grant stays in chapter 15 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. It is owned and operated by the Intercontinental Hotels Group, but again, note the proximity to the White House where Grant would have met Lincoln. In chapter 18 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule, Ulysses S. Grant moves Julia to City Point. This is the location of the cabin and other important military installations that Julia moves to before the Battle of Trent's Reach. And then this is the Appomattox Courthouse, National Historic Park. This is the location where General Robert E. Lee surrenders to General Ulysses S. Grant, effectively ending the Civil War. It is mentioned in Chapter 22 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. I want you to take a note of how close Appomattox is to Petersburg, City Point, Richmond, Washington, D.C. So, a little more history. April 14th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Grant himself has declined an invitation to stay to the theater because he wants to stay with his family in Burlington, New Jersey. November 27th, 1865, Grant is sent by Johnson on a fact-finding mission to the South to counter a pending, less favorable report by Senator Carl Schurz. In November 3rd, 1868, Grant is elected president. In 1872, he's elected on a second term. May 16th, 1877, after the rumored compromise of 1877, Hayes is president and Reconstruction is officially over. Grant and his family begin their 2-year world tour. So let's take a look at some of those locations. This is the house in Burlington. This is where Grant is visiting Julia when Lincoln is shot. This is mentioned throughout chapters 21 and 22 in Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. I wanted to kind of give you a perspective of where things are in Washington, D.C. So again, we are in D.C. The lower right-hand corner is the White House and the Willard Hotel. And then in the upper left-hand corner, that little blue dot, that is the house that the Grants moved to. And this is the Scott Grant house. This is that house. This is where they moved to after leaving Philadelphia at the beginning of chapter 24 in Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. And I just wanted to kind of give you a perspective of how close it was in that last slide to the White House. This, of course, is the White House. The Grants move into the executive residence of the White House in chapter 25 of the novel Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. This is the current location of Bridge Street AWME Church that Jule attends in chapter 25 of Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. Originally known as simply African Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal Church, the Bridge Street AWME Church was founded in downtown Brooklyn and moved to Bridge Street in Bed-Stuy in 1854. In 1938, it moved to its final location, on Stuyvesant Avenue. This is the location of the Long Branch, New Jersey summer cottage where Grant and his family escaped New York after financial disaster in chapter 26 of the novel Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule. I found a couple historical photos of the cottage itself, one of which you can see in the upper left. However, the building itself was torn down in the 1960s. However, this is the location of the Long Branch, New Jersey Church of the Presidents, where not only Ulysses S. Grant worshipped, but also Rutherford B. Hayes, James A. Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, and Woodrow Wilson. This is literally down the street from the location of the Long Branch, New Jersey summer cottage of the Grants. So it is a church they would have visited when they were escaping New York. So, a little more history. September 20th, 1879. At the end of their 2-year world tour, the Grant family arrives back in San Francisco. In 1881 to 1885, there is the Grant Ward Ponzi scheme, which sets off the Panic of 1884. On August 4th, 1884, is Grant's last public appearance at a service for Civil War veterans in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. In 1885, Grant has finally moved to New York for his health. Uh, July 18th, he finishes his memoirs with a 70% advance from Samuel Clemens. July 23rd, 1885, Grant dies at 8:08 a.m. in Mount McGregor, New York. And this is the cottage that the Grant family moves to in chapter 28 in Mount McGregor, New York. This is where Grant finishes memoirs, and this is the last place Ulysses S. Grant lives, and this is where he dies. This is Grant's tomb. It is in New York City on West 102nd Street and Riverside. It is the largest mausoleum in the United States, and is also a public park that you can visit and tour. So that is the world and the life of Ulysses S. Grant. Those are some of the locations in the novel Mrs. Grant and Madame Jule by Jennifer Schiavarini. We hope that you enjoyed this brief tour of those historical landmarks, and that you will visit East Cleveland Public Library to check out the book and enjoy the tale as well. Thank you for watching, and we hope you come read with us.